Hi, I'm Dave. Welcome to the channel. In this video, I'm going to look at the Avant Slot BMW 2002i. Right, let me tell you a little bit about the real version of this car. Now, this is obviously a BMW 2002i. Now, vintage racing, certainly in the mid to late 2010s, was getting really popular again all of a sudden, and a lot of people were restoring BMW 2002s, Datsun 510s, Alfa Romeos and the like, to race in a number of series, especially in the US. One of those people was a guy called Pat Womack, who at the time was the general manager of Laurel BMW of Westmont. He purchased a really shaky old shell that desperately needed an overhaul, and he needed it modified so that it would work for regulations for SVRA and VARA and others, so he could race in a number of championships. The car was not great, needed a lot of work, so he sent it off for restoration. He happened to stumble across a video of an M10 racing engine revving on a test stand at Vintage BMW Racing, which is kind of the screen name, they say, for Blasco Racing. So he contacted them, and after a conversation, he said, "I'll send you the car, you restore it, put the engine in it." So they agreed to do that, and they built it all back up into the car that you see today, and the model thereof. It has a 2-litre M10 engine in it. It's the OEM block and cylinder head with a load of racing internals, and it goes like stink. You will also notice the livery. Now, the livery is a BMW Motorsport livery, but it's not a period livery. It is a livery which has been invented to represent historic BMW racing, but in the modern era. So a whole lot of purists, and there were quite a lot of BMW 2002 purists, are a little bit up in arms about the fact that it's not an original legacy livery, but it doesn't really matter. The man can spend his money how he likes, and he's managed to put Warsteiner sponsorship on it, which means as a slot car, I love it, because I love anything with Warsteiner written on it. Now, a number of people have done versions of this car. In terms of this livery, Avant Slot have done a spot-on job with it. Everything's correct, all the stickers and everything are definitely in the right places, and the quality finish is very, very good indeed. Detailing around the bumpers and the lights is very, very fine. It's a very impressive model, and as I say, the paint finish itself is also very, very good. As you may know, this is not my only BMW 2002 with a beer livery on it, because I've got this Revo Slot Gusser Beer 2002i as well. And I thought, while I can't compare these two cars on the track, because that would be comparing apples and oranges, I can compare the bodies in terms of a model and how scale they may or may not be. And there are some differences here. From the front, they are pretty much the same width, and from above, I mean, they're broadly the same length. It's pretty good, that. I'd say that's a fair match. Where it goes different is at the back. Now, the back of the Revo Slot is considerably narrower than the back of the Avant Slot. If I line up this light and this light, you can see there's quite a difference in the width across the back here. Now, I'm not entirely sure which one of those two is correct, but one of them isn't. So I investigated further, and I looked at some pictures of this car and this car. There is definitely a difference here. I mean, ignore the wheels. But there is definitely a difference here in the depth of this part of the body. This one is a lot taller. This whole car is shrunk ever so slightly. And the difference can be seen in this rear quarter as well. Now, I've looked at all the pictures, and I think this one is more right than this one. I think there is some artistic license here. So, yeah, I think Avant Slot wins a bit more on the accuracy of scale over the Revo Slot. In terms of the detail, well, it's a bit of a fair match, actually, because there's definitely better detail on the front of the Revo Slot with the badge grille and so on. It's a bit more refined here than it is on the Avant. However, towards the back, I think the Avant wins. It's got 2-colour rear light lenses with the division in them. It's got, I think, probably better detailing across the back here. It's got a filler cap. Now, I don't know where the filler cap's supposed to be on this one, but it isn't anywhere. I know that's a minor detail, but, you know, let's point it out. And Revo Slot have gone for sort of just a kind of a little flat piece in the bodywork there to indicate some exit pipes for an exhaust system. Whereas Avant have gone for properly cutting out the bodywork and a tailpipe. I'm not quite sure that's a racing tailpipe. That looks a lot more like a standard out the dealership saloon tailpipe, but I don't know. Wheels are a bit of an issue, obviously. The Revo Slot ones are very tiny, and I think to be scale these are too small. However, I think Avant Slots are slightly too big. I think truth is probably somewhere between the two. So overall, I think in terms of finish, the Revo Slot would win. In terms of correctness, the Avant Slot wins. So I think that's about as far as we can really compare these two to each other. So I'm going to move on and look at the mechanical bits of this. And quickly, just before I take this car apart, I wanted to show you something. It's not set up brilliantly out of the box, that's for sure. If we look at this side of the car, this wheel is pretty much flush with the bodywork on the edge, as you'd expect it to be. This side, however, it's sticking out probably 2 millimeters or more, and there's not a lot of play in there. It's not going to sit differently, so something's not quite right with the front axle. That's not the worst of it. This guide is never going to pass the Rob Swift Slots paintbrush test. There is no spring in it whatsoever. It has no intention to self-center. So we might need to change that out, possibly for a Slotting Plus one, before we do anything. And copper braids. I don't like copper braids on stainless Carrera rails. Copper and stainless don't really like each other, and you sort of get a bit of black. I suppose it's a corrosion of some kind. There's a reaction there anyway, and it gets on these braids and it gets on the track, and it's never good. It builds up after a while and you have to wipe it off. Don't need that. So I'll just change these for some tin braids, whether I change the guide over or not. The other thing is, these rear wheels are definitely rubbing on both sides. I'm not even going to try and put this on the track like this. It's probably going to try and burn the motor out, trying to overcome the friction between, I think it's just this side. Which means I think the body is too far that way on this chassis. So I'm going to have to take this off and have a look and see what we can do about that. Having taken the body off and lined it up, and okay, this is slightly imprecise, but on my grid lines on my setup plate, I think I've seen the problem. Now, I'm fairly sure you won't be able to see it on camera, but I have lined the centre of the car up based on the corners of the bumper here and my view from here across these corners and down to the grid lines. And having done that, I say I don't think you're going to be able to see it, but from my perspective here, and I'll turn it around for you. Like I say, I don't expect you to be able to see it, but the very outside edge of this shell here is bowed ever so slightly, or not bowed, it's just somehow about 1.5 millimeters wider this side. So the reason and it's not offset between here and the tops of the arches, or here and the tops of the arches, because I've measured it. It's just the bottom section here, each side varies slightly. And in fact, this one's slightly longer than that one. I can see that. Just here. I might measure that while we're here. So that one's 54. And that one is 52. Yes, so the variation is in this section here, both in how long it is and how far bulged out it is, I guess. So I don't think there's an awful lot I can do about making this car sit square underneath this body, because it does sit square underneath this body. It's just the skirts are wrong, and I don't think there's anything I can do about that. Other things that annoyed me slightly, what is it with this whole putting the screw underneath the guide thing? I just wish people wouldn't do that. And that squeaks, so I'm going to have to put a bit of foil tape on there to stop that squeaking. Other than that, the body shell's good. Now this piece, well, I'm not quite sure at the moment whether the front wheel's buckled or whether it's just the tyre not sitting straight, and whether I could do anything about either. But they seem okay. Axle height wise, it's not far off. There are grub screws here to help adjust that should you need to, and although it's not drilled through, I don't think, there is a place here and here to drill through and put grub screws in if you wanted to further raise the front axle. But I think it's okay where it is. I might just need to shim it one way or the other very slightly in order to try and lose some of that visual discrepancy. But I don't want to run the car off off square. This wheel and tyre seems to be fairly good. This one has definitely got some issues of some sort. Now if I go to the back, the biggest issue here at the moment, don't know if you can see that, is that these brass bushings, while they might be clipped into this, what's a motor pod, they are completely loose and rattling about, which is going to mess with the mesh between these two and make a lot of noise and cause a lot of poor running. So I'm going to have to try and glue these bushings in. That may also deal with some of this wheel rubbing. In fact, you can see there's a witness mark there and a little one there, just from where I was turning these wheels with my fingers. And again, not sure that tyre's on great, and or round. Neither of these are great. This is all a little bit... I'm going to have to spend a bit of time making sure all of this sits straight. I mean, this motor pod is tight in this body. It's not moving at all. All of that, all of it, is in this axle setup. So I'm going to need to try and tighten all these things up, glue these bearings down, get these wheels a bit more round. I think they're fairly squared up on the chassis. Yes, the outside rim is on the line, both sides there. So I'm happy with that. This front axle is... I need to find a way of pushing it slightly further that way. So I'll have a go at that. And I'm just going to tinker about. And I'm not going to do it on camera because it will be a hell of a long video of me just going in fast forward. So I'll come back when I've done the things I've just mentioned.
One eternity later.
Well, I'm glad you didn't have to sit through all of that because it took ages. And you know me, I'm honest. So this was a bit of a nightmare, really. This car was in no way, I mean, don't even think about saying ready to run. It just was not. I'll try and go through as many of the things as I can remember that I had to deal with here, but I have finally got this thing to run on a track reasonably well. I mean, obviously, to start with, a bit of foil tape in here just takes the rattle and the squeak out of that, so that solved that problem. While we're here, the guide was sticking. There is no relationship between the diameter of this guide post and the diameter of the hole they provided. It's just too big. This guide was too big. I could have just drilled the hole out a little bit here, but in the end I went for a Slotting Plus guide with some Slotting Plus braid, so that sorted all of that out. Did just have to nip the top off the Slotting Plus guide because this piece is quite shallow, but it fits nicely, and the Rob Swift slots test, it does move with a paintbrush, so that's all good. Lovely. The front axle, now you can't see it in here, but on the outside of these little upstands there's a piece of moulding that sticks, if that's mould, it sticks out this way towards the wheel. On the outside of that were these nylon washers, which weren't sitting on a flat face, so they were causing all sorts of issues. So I took those out because they were not helping the situation at all. The other reason they weren't helping the situation is because this axle is actually, I think, probably too short. It's a very nice piece of steel, but I think it should be 2 or 3 millimeters longer. And on top of that, the reason that one wheel was stuck out too far was because the hole the axle goes into just wasn't moulded properly. I had to drill it out further. One side was okay, the other side was not, which accounted for quite a lot of that odd crabbing that was going on. And once I'd managed to get the axle into the wheel the same amount on both wheels, and I had to true the front wheels because they definitely weren't round, and then I put the tyres back on them and trued those, and then finally I've got to a point where it's not ideal and there is a click in there, but it's running smoother. There's still a bit of a rattle, but the wheels sit in the right place at the front with relation to the body, and they spin smoothly, so I'm calling that a win at that end. Now to the back end, well, I had to obviously glue these bushings in here, which I did with some runny super glue and just a cocktail stick just to dab it in, just so that it capillary action took it round the bearing, and it's glued in nice and solidly. The wheels were quite round, didn't really have to true those. The tyres took a ridiculous amount of truing and then further sanding the edges and putting radiuses on them and trying to adjust the wheels in ever so slightly to sort out this clearance issue here. And I have finally managed to do that, and it's required a lot of jiggling about and just moving this crown wheel fractions of a millimetre in either direction just to get that axle in just the right place. And now nothing rubs. On top of that, his gears are really noisy. I've tried everything. I ended up running them in with car polish for about 30 minutes and it's quietened it down a bit. But as slot cars go, it's still quite noisy. It's a mechanical noisy, but it's not like a bad gear whine. I don't know, maybe it's a noise from within inside the motor. It's a strange noise and I can't seem to get rid of it at the moment. But I have run this car, although I've only run it with the motor pod done up tight because any movement in there is going to cause me wheel rub again here. But it runs quite nicely. It was just a fight. Several hours of battles trying to just fettle everything just so. Yeah, this is a car that you really need to think about before you even put it on the track, which is odd because the previous two Avant Slots I got, the Mitsubishi and the Manta, were brilliant. Straight out of the box you could stick them on the track and they were good. This one was unfortunately far from that. Another thing I want to mention while I'm here, at 12.5 millimetres from the middle of the car is this ridge. This ridge, if it was a couple of millimetres that way or a couple of millimetres that way, or if there was a bit of a cutout in the moulding, you'd be able to put a Carrera digital chip in with a sensor. But with this ridge here, I would say this car is not impossible, but very, very awkward to try and chip for Carrera digital. So forget that on this one. It's really just got to be an analog car. Runs all right because obviously inline motor, so it's almost like a magnet car. But right, I'll put this back together and we'll pop it on the track and we'll give it a few laps before we sum everything up. Okay, let's go for some laps. As you can see, it's a fairly stable car, especially with the changed over guide for the Slotting Plus guide. It's very keen to stay in the slot, and it's fairly, because I had to radius the outside of the rear tyres to get them to clearance with the body, it's fairly forgiving in the corners. It doesn't generally want to tip as a result of the rear tyres getting dug in or anything. It's still a bit noisy, and it's a little bit of gear noise, but there is definitely a slightly strange chirp to it that I'm sure is something coming from the motor. I don't believe it's a bad thing. I think it might just be, I don't know, something's rubbing a little bit. It'll wear in, I'm sure. But overall, as you can see, nice and easy to drive, nice and easy to get into a rhythm with as well. It really responds well. Oops. So how to sum up this car? Well, as a model, it's excellent. I think the scale is close, if not right. Out of the box, though, all sorts of issues with it. But once I'd sorted them out, it's a lovely running car. I did manage just about 6 seconds, just a shade over, which is not as much as I was expecting, given that both of my other two Avant Slots perform somewhat better than this. But this is not I don't believe a modern or more recent design of Avant slot car. I think this one has been around a while, and I think that probably shows advances in slot cars have come a long way in recent times. And I think you can tell that this one is just probably in need of an update, at least mechanically. But overall, very impressed with this. Really quite enjoyed driving it. It looks lovely. It's got Warsteiner livery on it. What's not to love? As always, thanks for watching one of my videos. If you liked it, you will find a button specifically for that. Please subscribe to the channel. It really does help. It helps the algorithm and it doesn't cost you anything. And if you hit the bell, you'll get a notification next time I post a video. And as always, check out this slot car channel.